NATO nuclear sharing emerged not as a single decision, but as a gradual solution to a profound strategic contradiction that defined the early Cold War, because the United States sought to deter Soviet aggression in Europe with nuclear weapons while simultaneously preventing the spread of independent nuclear arsenals among its allies. A dilemma that became acute as Western Europe rebuilt from the devastation of World War II and confronted the reality that its conventional forces were vastly inferior to those of the Soviet Union and its allies. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the balance of power on the continent appeared dangerously tilted, as the Red Army maintained massive ground forces positioned deep into Eastern Europe, while Western European states struggled with economic recovery, political instability, and the lingering trauma of occupation, creating a situation in which American nuclear weapons became the ultimate guarantor of security, but also a source of dependence that threatened alliance cohesion. European leaders feared that reliance on U.S. nuclear protection might prove unreliable in a crisis, particularly if Washington hesitated to risk its own cities for the defense of distant allies, a fear that drove pressures for national nuclear programs in countries such as the United Kingdom and France, and raised the specter of uncontrolled proliferation within the Western Bloc. NATO nuclear sharing emerged as a compromise designed to manage these anxieties by embedding U.S. nuclear weapons within Allied territory while retaining ultimate American control, creating a system that signaled collective commitment without surrendering authority over nuclear use. This arrangement was shaped by both strategic necessity and political symbolism, because the presence of nuclear weapons on European soil served as a tangible demonstration that any conflict in Europe would immediately implicate the United States, thereby strengthening deterrence by tying American security directly to that of its allies. At the same time, nuclear sharing allowed European governments to claim a role in nuclear defense planning, alleviating fears of marginalization and reinforcing the idea that NATO was a partnership rather than a hierarchy, even though the reality of decision-making remained heavily centralized in Washington. The mechanics of nuclear sharing were deliberately complex, involving the deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons to Allied bases, the training of Allied pilots and crews to deliver them, and the maintenance of dual-key arrangements that required both U.S. and host nation authorization for use, a structure designed to balance reassurance with control and to prevent unilateral action while preserving the credibility of deterrence. This system reflected a broader Cold War pattern in which ambiguity was not a flaw, but a feature, as uncertainty about exact procedures and thresholds enhanced deterrence by complicating adversary calculations and discouraging attempts to exploit perceived seams in alliance decision-making. The political implications of nuclear sharing were significant because it transformed NATO from a conventional defensive alliance into a nuclear integrated system, binding member states into a shared strategic posture that blurred the line between national sovereignty and collective security. For smaller NATO members, participation in nuclear sharing offered both prestige and reassurance, signaling inclusion in the highest levels of alliance planning, while anchoring their security firmly within the American nuclear umbrella. For the United States, the system provided a means of controlling proliferation while maintaining influence, ensuring that nuclear weapons remained instruments of alliance policy rather than national ambition. Yet this arrangement was not without controversy, as critics argued that nuclear sharing undermined non-proliferation norms by effectively spreading nuclear capabilities under the guise of control, raising questions about legality and consistency that would later become central to debates over the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. From the Soviet perspective, NATO nuclear sharing was viewed as a destabilizing provocation because it placed nuclear weapons closer to Soviet borders and integrated additional states into nuclear planning, expanding the number of potential launch platforms and complicating defensive calculations, reinforcing Moscow's perception that NATO sought not merely defense, but strategic dominance. This perception fueled an arms race dynamic in which deployments begat counter-deployments, contributing to cycles of escalation that increased the density and lethality of nuclear forces in Europe and heightened the risk of miscalculation. Internally, NATO grappled with the moral and political implications of embedding nuclear weapons in democratic societies still haunted by the memory of total war, as public opinion oscillated between acceptance of nuclear deterrence as a necessary evil and fear of becoming frontline targets in a superpower confrontation. Governments had to manage secrecy, protest, and alliance discipline simultaneously, navigating domestic opposition while maintaining a unified external posture, a balancing act that underscored how nuclear sharing was as much a political instrument as a military one. Over time, the system evolved in response to technological change and strategic reassessment, adapting to new delivery systems, shifting doctrines, and changing perceptions of risk. Yet its core logic remained consistent, rooted in the belief that shared nuclear responsibility strengthened deterrence by demonstrating that any attack would trigger an immediate and collective response. This belief reflected the broader Cold War assumption that stability depended not on the elimination of nuclear weapons, but on their careful integration into alliance structures, an assumption that prioritized control and predictability over disarmament and placed enormous faith in rational decision-making under conditions of extreme stress. NATO nuclear sharing thus became one of the most enduring and controversial features of the Cold War security architecture, embodying the tension between deterrence and proliferation, sovereignty and alliance, reassurance and risk, and revealing how the Cold War transformed nuclear weapons from national instruments into collective symbols of commitment and vulnerability. As the system took shape, it set precedents that would influence later debates about alliance cohesion, nuclear ethics, and the limits of shared responsibility, ensuring that nuclear sharing would remain a defining element of NATO's identity and a persistent source of controversy long after the Cold War itself had ended. As NATO nuclear sharing matured through the 1960s, it became increasingly intertwined with broader debates over control, credibility, and escalation, because the system's very existence forced alliance members to confront uncomfortable questions about who would decide the fate of Europe in a nuclear war and under what circumstances such decisions could be made, revealing that deterrence was not a static condition, but a continuously negotiated balance between reassurance and restraint. The introduction of more flexible nuclear doctrines reflected growing concern that reliance on massive retaliation alone lacked credibility, as European leaders worried that the United States might hesitate to respond to limited Soviet aggression with all-out nuclear war, prompting a search for options that could signal resolve without immediately triggering catastrophe. This strategic evolution reshaped nuclear sharing arrangements. As tactical nuclear weapons became central to NATO planning, deployed in large numbers across Allied territory, and integrated into operational concepts that envisioned their use on the battlefield, blurring the distinction between conventional and nuclear war and raising the stakes of any conflict in Europe. For NATO planners, these weapons offered a way to offset conventional inferiority and complicate Soviet calculations. Yet their forward deployment also increased the risk that local crises could escalate rapidly, as commanders and political leaders would face intense pressure to act before losing assets or initiative. The logic of shared nuclear responsibility thus deepened rather than diminished anxiety, because participation in nuclear planning meant confronting the possibility that Allied soil would be the first to be devastated in any nuclear exchange, transforming deterrence from an abstract guarantee into a tangible and terrifying reality. These tensions were reflected in internal alliance debates, as some members pushed for greater influence over nuclear decisions, while others feared that decentralization would undermine control and increase the likelihood of unauthorized or premature use. The creation of consultative mechanisms sought to manage these concerns by institutionalizing dialogue and coordination, reinforcing the appearance of shared authority while preserving ultimate American control, a delicate compromise that maintained alliance cohesion but left underlying questions unresolved. These mechanisms also served a political function, reassuring domestic audiences that their governments had a voice in matters of existential importance, even as secrecy limited transparency and accountability. At the same time, nuclear sharing intersected with national ambitions, as states like France rejected integration in favor of independent nuclear forces, arguing that true sovereignty required autonomous control over ultimate weapons, a stance that highlighted the limits of collective arrangements and exposed fractures within the Western Bloc. France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command underscored the reality that nuclear sharing could not fully reconcile divergent national visions of security, and that alliance unity depended as much on political compromise as on strategic logic. The existence of independent nuclear forces, alongside shared arrangements, complicated deterrence calculations, introducing additional layers of uncertainty that both strengthened and destabilized the overall balance, as adversaries struggled to anticipate responses in a crisis involving multiple nuclear actors. For non-nuclear NATO members, nuclear sharing remained both a reassurance and a burden, as participation implied acceptance of risk without full control, forcing governments to justify policies that made their territories prime targets while offering limited influence over outcomes. Public opposition to nuclear deployments grew over time, particularly as awareness of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons increased, and social movements challenged the legitimacy of deterrence, turning nuclear sharing into a focal point of protest and political contention within democratic societies. These movements exposed the gap between strategic elites and public sentiment, revealing how nuclear policy often rested on assumptions that were difficult to reconcile with popular values and fears. Managing this gap required careful framing, secrecy, and alliance discipline, reinforcing the perception that nuclear sharing operated in a realm removed from ordinary democratic debate. Internationally, the spread of shared nuclear arrangements fueled accusations that NATO was undermining global efforts to limit nuclear weapons, complicating negotiations on arms control and non-proliferation by blurring distinctions between nuclear and non-nuclear states. The resulting tension became particularly acute during discussions surrounding the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as critics argued that nuclear sharing violated the spirit, if not the letter, of emerging norms, while proponents insisted that the system preserved stability by preventing independent proliferation. This debate highlighted a central contradiction of the Cold War, that measures designed to control nuclear danger could simultaneously entrench reliance on nuclear weapons and delay meaningful disarmament. Despite these controversies, nuclear sharing persisted because it addressed immediate alliance needs in a volatile environment, reinforcing deterrence while managing internal pressures for autonomy and security. The system's endurance reflected the Cold War's pragmatic ethos, prioritizing stability through managed risk rather than transformation through abolition. Yet this pragmatism came at a cost, as the normalization of nuclear weapons within alliance structures made their potential use a routine subject of planning rather than an unthinkable last resort, embedding nuclear logic into military and political culture in ways that would prove difficult to reverse. By the late Cold War, nuclear sharing had become not only a strategic arrangement, but a symbol of NATO's identity, embodying both the strength and the fragility of collective security under nuclear shadow, and demonstrating how the alliance sought to reconcile unity, deterrence, and control in a world where miscalculation could mean annihilation. By the 1970s and 1980s, NATO nuclear sharing had become deeply embedded in the daily routines, assumption, and contingency plans of the alliance, even as the strategic environment grew more complex and the risks associated with nuclear integration became increasingly apparent, because technological advances, arms control efforts, and shifting political landscapes forced NATO to continually reassess how shared nuclear responsibility could be maintained without triggering instability or undermining emerging norms against proliferation. The introduction of new delivery systems, including dual-capable aircraft and increasingly sophisticated tactical weapons, expanded the operational scope of nuclear sharing while simultaneously compressing decision timelines, heightening concerns that crises could escalate faster than political leaders could manage, particularly in scenarios involving ambiguous attacks or rapid conventional breakthroughs. This compression reinforced reliance on pre-delegated planning and rehearsed procedures, embedding nuclear response deeper into military culture and reducing the margin for improvisation, a reality that troubled some policymakers who feared that deterrence was becoming dangerously automated. Arms control agreements, rather than diminishing the importance of nuclear sharing, often forced its adaptation, as limits on strategic weapons shifted emphasis toward theater forces and tactical systems in Europe, ensuring that shared nuclear arrangements remained central to deterrence even as global arsenals were capped. This dynamic revealed a paradox of arms control during the Cold War, that efforts to stabilize the strategic balance could intensify focus on lower yield, forward-deployed weapons whose use might seem more plausible, thereby increasing the risk of limited nuclear conflict. Internally, NATO faced growing political strain as public opposition to nuclear deployments intensified, particularly in countries hosting shared weapons, where mass protests challenged the legitimacy of policies that placed local populations on the front line of nuclear confrontation. These movements did not reject alliance membership outright, but questioned the assumption that security required nuclear integration, forcing governments to defend deterrence not only against external threats, but against domestic skepticism. Managing this opposition required a combination of reassurance, secrecy, and political compromise, as leaders sought to maintain alliance cohesion while acknowledging public fears, a balancing act that exposed the democratic tension at the heart of nuclear sharing. Despite protests, the system endured because no viable alternative emerged that could satisfy both deterrence requirements and alliance politics, reinforcing the sense that nuclear sharing was a necessary but deeply uncomfortable compromise. From the Soviet perspective, NATO's continued reliance on shared nuclear arrangements confirmed suspicions that Western rhetoric about arms control masked a determination to preserve nuclear advantage, fueling counter-deployments and reinforcing the perception that Europe remained the primary nuclear battlefield. This perception fed cycles of action and reaction, as each side sought to signal resolve while avoiding escalation, a process that increased the density of nuclear forces and multiplied the points at which miscalculation could occur. Crisis simulations and near-miss incidents during this period underscored how tightly coupled the system had become, revealing scenarios in which misinterpretation, technical error, or unauthorized action could have triggered catastrophic outcomes, lending urgency to debates about command, control, and communication within shared arrangements. These debates highlighted the inherent fragility of a system that relied on flawless coordination among multiple states under extreme stress, a fragility that critics argued was incompatible with democratic accountability and human fallibility. Yet proponents countered that the very complexity of nuclear sharing enhanced deterrence by making adversary calculations more uncertain, reinforcing the belief that ambiguity and entanglement were stabilizing rather than dangerous. This belief reflected the Cold War's broader reliance on managed uncertainty as a tool of stability, a strategy that accepted risk as unavoidable and sought to channel it rather than eliminate it. As the Cold War drew toward its end, NATO nuclear sharing remained intact, not because it was universally accepted, but because it had become inseparable from the alliance's conception of collective defense, embedded in treaties, procedures, and political expectations that proved resistant to change. The persistence of nuclear sharing into the late Cold War thus illustrates how security arrangements, once institutionalized, can outlast the conditions that gave rise to them, sustained by inertia, alliance politics, and the absence of consensus on alternatives. In this way, nuclear sharing exemplified the Cold War's enduring logic, prioritizing continuity and control over transformation, and revealing how the management of nuclear danger often depended less on reducing weapons than on embedding them within structures designed to distribute responsibility while diffusing accountability. As the Cold War began to fracture in the late 1980s, NATO nuclear sharing entered a moment of quiet but profound uncertainty, because the strategic logic that had sustained it for decades was no longer anchored in a clearly defined adversary or an unquestioned expectation of large-scale conflict in Europe. Yet the system itself remained deeply embedded in alliance identity, making change politically sensitive and institutionally difficult. The collapse of communist governments across Eastern Europe and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact removed the immediate justification for massive forward-deployed nuclear forces, raising fundamental questions about whether nuclear sharing continued to serve deterrence or had become an anachronism sustained by habit and fear of destabilizing the alliance. For many European publics, the end of ideological confrontation intensified calls for the removal of nuclear weapons from their territory, reframing nuclear sharing not as protection, but as unnecessary risk in a transformed security environment. Governments, however, faced a dilemma, because dismantling shared nuclear arrangements risked signaling disunity or weakness at a moment when the future of NATO itself was uncertain, and leaders feared that rapid change could unravel the cohesion that had preserved stability for 40 years. The United States, navigating its own reassessment of global commitments, viewed nuclear sharing as both a legacy burden and a reassurance tool, recognizing that while the immediate threat had receded, the symbolic value of extended deterrence remained central to alliance confidence, particularly for newer or more vulnerable members. This tension produced a cautious approach in which reductions and adjustments were favored over abolition, preserving the framework of nuclear sharing while reducing its scale and visibility, a strategy designed to balance reassurance with adaptation. The persistence of nuclear sharing into the post-Cold War era revealed how deeply the system had become intertwined with questions of trust, credibility, and identity, as allies equated the presence of U.S. nuclear weapons with American commitment and feared that their removal might foreshadow disengagement. This fear underscored a central lesson of the Cold War, that alliances are sustained not only by threats, but by symbols, and that nuclear weapons, however dangerous, had become powerful markers of political resolve. At the same time, The continuation of nuclear sharing complicated efforts to redefine NATO's purpose in a world no longer organized around bipolar confrontation, raising questions about whether an alliance built around nuclear deterrence could adapt to new missions without reproducing old risks. Critics argued that maintaining shared nuclear arrangements undermined non-proliferation norms and delayed meaningful progress toward disarmament, perpetuating a double standard in which some states relied on nuclear weapons while discouraging others from pursuing them. Proponents countered that nuclear sharing remained a stabilizing force, preventing independent proliferation and anchoring deterrence within a controlled framework, rather than allowing it to fragment into national arsenals. This debate reflected unresolved tensions at the heart of nuclear governance, tensions that were not resolved by the end of the Cold War, but merely reframed in a new context where threats were less predictable and alliances more fluid. The endurance of nuclear sharing thus illustrates how Cold War institutions can persist beyond the conditions that created them, shaping security policy through inertia and symbolism as much as through necessity. In this sense, NATO nuclear sharing did not simply survive the Cold War, but carried its logic forward, embedding assumptions about deterrence, risk, and collective responsibility into the post-Cold War order, and ensuring that nuclear weapons remained woven into the fabric of European security, even as the world they were designed to confront disappeared. The continued existence of NATO nuclear sharing into the post-Cold War period revealed how profoundly the arrangement had shaped alliance psychology, because even as the immediate threat of large-scale war in Europe faded, the habits of deterrence and the institutional structures built around shared nuclear responsibility proved resistant to dismantling, reflecting a deeper uncertainty about how security could be guaranteed in a world no longer defined by clear blocks. For many NATO members, nuclear sharing had become synonymous with belonging, a tangible expression of solidarity that reassured smaller states that their security concerns would not be marginalized as global attention shifted elsewhere, reinforcing the idea that nuclear weapons, however controversial, remained symbols of political commitment rather than merely instruments of war. This symbolic function complicated reform efforts, because any move to remove shared nuclear forces risked being interpreted as a weakening of extended deterrence and a step toward strategic disengagement, fears that were particularly acute in regions historically exposed to great power rivalry. At the same time, the persistence of nuclear sharing generated friction within the alliance, as debates over modernization, basing, and cost sharing exposed divergent threat perceptions and political priorities, revealing that unity often depended on suppressing disagreement rather than resolving it. These debates intensified as arms control and disarmament gained prominence in international discourse, placing NATO's continued reliance on shared nuclear weapons under renewed scrutiny and forcing policymakers to justify arrangements rooted in Cold War logic to publics increasingly skeptical of nuclear risk. The challenge lay in reconciling commitments to non-proliferation and risk reduction with alliance practices that appeared to normalize nuclear weapons and distribute their potential use across multiple states, a contradiction that underscored the difficulty of moving beyond deterrence without undermining confidence. Despite reductions in numbers and visibility, the operational core of nuclear sharing remained intact, sustained by training, planning, and the maintenance of delivery systems that ensured readiness even as the likelihood of use receded, illustrating how deterrence relies on preparation for scenarios that leaders hope will never occur. This preparation, while intended to preserve peace, also perpetuated a culture of secrecy and exceptionalism, insulating nuclear policy from democratic oversight and reinforcing the perception that decisions of existential importance were made in closed circles beyond public scrutiny. Critics argued that such insulation was incompatible with democratic values and increased the risk of miscalculation, while proponents maintained that discretion was essential to credible deterrence, reflecting a tension that has characterized nuclear governance since its inception. The endurance of nuclear sharing thus highlights a broader pattern in international security that systems designed to manage extreme risk can become self-sustaining, perpetuated by fear of the unknown consequences of change rather than confidence in new approaches. This pattern suggests that the legacy of the Cold War is not merely historical, but structural, embedded in institutions and assumptions that continue to shape policy long after the original context has disappeared. NATO nuclear sharing stands as a case study in how alliances navigate uncertainty by clinging to familiar mechanisms, even when their rationale is contested, revealing the difficulty of transitioning from a world defined by deterrence to one grounded in cooperative security. Its persistence raises enduring questions about whether stability achieved through shared risk is sustainable, or whether it merely defers confrontation with the deeper challenge of redefining security without reliance on weapons whose use would be catastrophic. In this sense, nuclear sharing represents both continuity and contradiction, a legacy of the Cold War that continues to shape European security and global nuclear politics, embodying the unresolved tension between deterrence and disarmament that remains one of the defining dilemmas of the modern international order. The full significance of NATO nuclear sharing lies in how it encapsulates the Cold War's fundamental approach to managing existential danger, because the system was built on the assumption that security could be preserved not by eliminating nuclear weapons, but by embedding them within alliances that distributed risk, responsibility, and fear in ways intended to prevent any single actor from acting alone. This approach reflected a belief that stability emerged from entanglement, that by tying the fate of multiple states to the same instruments of destruction, the likelihood of reckless action would be reduced, even as the consequences of failure became more widespread. Nuclear sharing thus transformed nuclear weapons from purely national assets into collective symbols of commitment, signaling that any attack would trigger a response involving multiple governments and therefore escalate beyond bilateral confrontation. This collective logic strengthened deterrence, but also diffused accountability, making it difficult to assign responsibility for decisions that would affect millions, and raising enduring questions about democratic control over the most consequential choices imaginable. The system's endurance across decades of technological change, political upheaval, and shifting threat perceptions illustrates how deeply nuclear sharing became woven into NATO's identity, shaping not only military planning, but alliance culture and expectations. Even as the Cold War ended, the habits of shared deterrence persisted, sustained by the fear that abandoning familiar structures could create instability or invite coercion, revealing how security arrangements can become ends in themselves rather than means to an evolving purpose. NATO nuclear sharing also highlights the moral ambiguity at the heart of Cold War deterrence, because while the system aimed to prevent war, it did so by normalizing preparation for mass destruction and by placing civilian populations at risk in the name of collective defense. This ambiguity has never been fully resolved, and debates over nuclear sharing continue to reflect unresolved tensions between the desire for safety and the ethical implications of relying on weapons whose use would be catastrophic. In historical perspective, nuclear sharing stands as one of the most consequential yet least understood elements of Cold War strategy, operating largely in the background while shaping perceptions of alliance credibility and global stability. Its legacy is not simply that nuclear weapons were shared, but that responsibility for nuclear risk was collectively managed. a model that influenced how alliances approached deterrence and how states reconciled sovereignty with collective security. Understanding NATO nuclear sharing thus provides insight into the broader Cold War system, revealing how fear, trust, and power were organized to prevent disaster while perpetuating reliance on instruments that threatened it. The enduring presence of nuclear sharing in European security underscores how the Cold War's solutions have outlived the problems they were designed to address, leaving behind structures that continue to shape policy and debate in a world still grappling with the challenge of reducing nuclear danger without undermining stability.